So essentially, this is the exact opposite response to that most people have when they hear about um, the binding of Isaac. One second. Let me. Okay, so if we want to think about the parsha, there's different ways to think about the parsha, many different topics to explore, and the culmination is the binding of Isaac. Um, so we can think a little bit about that, but also try to think about it in the context of the entire parsha, and specifically a little bit of what we discussed on Tuesday, which is what happens in this parsha that did not happen in the previous parsha. Because if you think about it, the portions of Abraham, there's basically two portions that are primarily about Abraham. You have Lech Lecha, last week's parsha. You have Vayera, this week's parsha. And the division is an interesting, the division is an interesting point. The division is the place where is an unnatural space to divide the parshas, because the division is smack in the middle of the story of circumcision. In fact, you have the story of circumcision, and then it says, Vayera, this week's parsha, Vayera Elav Hashem, and God appeared to him. God appeared to him. Who's the him? Right? God appeared to him. Who's the him? That's the opening statement. So obviously, it's a continuation from last week, right? So it's right after last week's parsha, it's a continuation to the circumcision. So the circumcision, and here's the aftermath of the circumcision. So we're basically cutting the parshas exactly in the middle of a story of the circumcision and its aftermath. So we discussed this a little in the past, is that there's different opinions. So why divide the parsha at this point? And the first thing that comes to mind is the Barbanel. What does the Barbanel say? Barbanel says that we're talking here about it's a different Abraham. Why is it a different Abraham? Because up till now, Abraham was indeed a great prophet, a great sage, he discovered God on his own, etc. But what happens after that is that, but because he's a physical person, when he experiences prophecy, he either the prophecies were at night. Sometimes last week's parsha, the covenant between the parts, it says God appeared to him at night. That could be a dream, a vision. Vision is obviously not as clear as just what we're going to describe in a moment. So he does experience prophecy, but it's either in a dream or in a vision. And he would also fall on his face. In other words, the experience of prophecy is overwhelming. And we know that from other places, because in the prophets we read that when prophets would prophesy, they would collapse on their face and really forget about. They would go into a trance. They weren't cognizant of the civilized world, and that's why in the book of prophets sometimes they refer to the prophet as the Meshuggah, the crazy person, because when you experience prophecy, you're not in your rational mind. But so that's Abraham up to the circumcision. When you come to the circumcision, all of a sudden, here, when you come to the circumcision, all of a sudden, Abraham is sitting in the middle of the day at the opening of his tent, sees angels, which he thinks are people. He's talking to the people in the presence of God while he's experiencing the revelation from above. So that Barbanel says this is a transformation. This is where you divide the parsha. There's Abraham pre-circumcision and Abraham post-circumcision. Pre-circumcision would be Abraham, everything that he could achieve on his own. Post-circumcision, okay, let's put that upon. Post-circumcision, it's a new person. If he's a new person, he's going to get he's going to have this concept where the holiness permeates the body. And because the holiness permeates the body is no longer a contradiction to the revelation. So God could appear to you, so you can have the awareness of the presence of God, while being in the physical world and interacting with people. It's not a contradiction. Why? Because the materialism, the flesh, has been refined, if that makes sense. So that's sort of that Barbanel's point of the division between these two parshas. And there are many other ways of explaining this division. There's Hasidic ways, there's obviously there's similarities and they overlap, but it's basically the big question of what happens between the two parshas. And what's the shift? Because again, when you study the Torah, it's not just the events change, but the character develops. So how does Abraham's character develop? And the point, one element is now the physical is no longer a contradiction. And we talked about this, that the place of transformation is the circumcision. What is circumcision? Circumcision is a mitzvah that you could actually see how it affects the physical body. Every other mitzvah, you put on tefillin. Later in the day, you don't see you put on tefillin. You know, sometimes you stop a Jew, say you want to put on tefillin. Say, oh, I just put on, look, I still have the straps. I still have the marks of the tefillin. Right? But that only lasts for a few moments. In other words, you can't see a change. You know, you look at an arm, you don't know, is this an arm that lit Shabbos candles? Maybe yeah, maybe no. You look at somebody's, if you go to the doctor and you take an X-ray, do you see, is this a digestive system that consumed matzah? Maybe yeah, maybe no. You can't really see it. But circumcision is it's clear. The Torah says, Haita briti b'yivsarchem, my covenant will be in your flesh. Not just some abstract concept that we believe in God, but the circumcision is that it affects the physical body and it affects the holiness. Now, we believe it makes the physical holy. We believe that this is true about every mitzvah. Every mitzvah we do, we believe it changes and it permeates the physical creation with holiness. We believe that, but we don't necessarily see it. Where it could be seen, even on a tangible way, that the God's commandment affects the body is circumcision. So that Barbanel says, now it makes sense. The circumcision is in the flesh. So now the flesh has been refined. So now the flesh is not a contradiction to the revelation of above. So the big change happens after the circumcision. So that's one way of putting it. Another way of thinking about this, similar way. You know what? Let's stay on this way for a moment. Let's stay on this way for a moment. What did Abraham do? So Abraham, you read the stories of Abraham, there's a lot going on. He has relatively dramatic life, at least in comparison to Isaac, maybe not as dramatic as Jacob, but certainly more dramatic than Isaac. But he lived a long time, lived 175 years. So what did he do all day? What did he do all day? What was his career? What did he do? So the Torah tells us what he did. And the phrase is, Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem, Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem. There he called in the name of God. And that phrase appears both in last parsha and in this parsha. And in last parsha, does it appear more than once? I don't remember. But the phrase appears last parsha and appears this parsha. So that's what he did. And how did he call in the name of God? What format did he use? We're talking about Vicky's, the Chabad rabbi in New Jersey. His format is Instagram he's always making videos and he gets a lot of followings. That's how he calls in the name of God. But there was no Instagram. So what format did Abraham use? So the format he used is he made an inn. In this week's parsha, it says, Vayita Eshel Be'Vayera. He made an inn in Beersheba. And there he sat and he gave people food and drink. And then he would give you the bill. The bill was very expensive because who has food, who has meat in the middle of a desert? So it's very expensive. And people say, so expensive, we didn't want to pay. But first he would say, bless God. They said, we don't want to bless God. So then he would give the bill. And they would say, we don't want to pay. So he said, oh, you don't want to pay? If you don't want to pay, you got to thank God. So they would thank God and they wouldn't have to pay the bill. That's what the Medrash says, because the Medrash looks at that verse. At the first half, the first clause says, Vayita Eshel Be'Vayera. He planted a eshel, which is either a orchard or a tent or an inn in Beersheba. And the second clause is that he called in the name of God. So those two are connected because he used his inn to teach about Hashem. So that's this week's parsha. So that's what he did. Last week's parsha, it also says that he called in the name of Hashem. So he did it last parsha and he did it this parsha. Now, when you see something being repeated, so one way to look at it is, oh, the same thing happened again. But if you think about it in a deeper perspective, you're supposed to look carefully, are there any subtle changes between the two places? And if there is a subtle change, then the Torah is signaling to you that there's a change here. Because where do you see a change? You see a change in comparison to the similarity. In other words, if Abraham did a bunch of things in one parsha and he did completely different things in a different parsha, then you don't see that he changed. You just see he's reacting to different circumstances. But if you see he did the same thing in the first parsha, and then he did the same thing in the second parsha, but then he did it a little bit different, so now he changed, right? So we want to look at these two parsha. I read this on Tuesday. You can do this to many different parts of the parsha, but I want to do it to one specific point, and what that is the calling of the name of Hashem. Last parsha says that, and he called in the name of Hashem. This week's parsha says, and he called in the name of Hashem. Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem. He called there in the name of Hashem, Kel Olam, the God of the world. Doesn't say the last parsha, God of the world. This parsha says the God of the world. Now, if you want to get specific and think about the Hebrew grammar, to say the God of the world, you need a hey. You need the letter hey. So you say Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem, Kel, the God of Ha'olam. And everyone knows the word Ha'olam. We say it in all the blessings. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech, King of Ha'olam, the world. King of the world. In this parsha, however, when it comes to the idea, and he called there in the name of Hashem, it drops the hey. So instead of saying God of the world, it says God world. He called there in the name God world. Now, if I was the editor of the book, I would stop right there and say, you need a hey. But thank God I wasn't the editor. So they wrote it and it's missing the grammar. And you can say, what is going on here? But there's a deep idea here. And there's a deep idea to explain what the Torah is saying in this, just specifically this word. And then it's to extrapolate from there, what does this little change tell us about Abraham himself changing or developing? And like I said, how do you see the development? When something so similar happens again, and yet the response is different. And it happens many times, like I mentioned before, that some of these stories are repeated. Like, for example, Sarah was taken to Pharaoh last week, and she's taken to Abimelech this week, right? So almost like, and there he said she's his sister, and here he said she's his sister. So now you can come and look at what are the differences. How did Pharaoh respond? How did Abimelech respond? What does that tell you about the culture of Egypt versus the culture in Israel, in Canaan? So I'm just putting it out there that's a whole a genre of way of interpretation, is that you look for the differences specifically where you see similarity. The similarity makes those differences more interesting. Okay, so what am I saying? First of all, where do I know this from? So the Rebbe gave this commentary, not about the Parsha, but he quoted this verse the first night when the Rebbe assumed the formal leadership of Chabad. Because we know the previous Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, passed away in 1950, 10th of Shvat. And all year, people were trying to ask the Rebbe to assume leadership, and he didn't want to. But long story short, a year later, on the 10th of Shvat, 1951, the Rebbe assumed the leadership. How do you assume the leadership? You say a formal Hasidic discourse. The Rebbe would say talks many years before that, because his father-in-law told him to. But a formal Hasidic discourse, only a Rebbe says a formal Hasidic discourse. So the Rebbe says a formal Hasidic discourse, Bati Legani, have come to my garden, which is a verse in the Song of Songs, which we spoke about many years ago. By now it's many years ago. We spoke about the Song of Songs on Friday mornings, and we spoke about that discourse on Friday mornings, but okay. So in that discourse, and in some ways that's the mission statement, the Rebbe says, the mission statement of our generation, the seventh generation of Chabad generations, of Chabad Rebbes. So there, it talks about the idea, quotes the Medrash, that Moses is the seventh generation from Abraham, and we're also the seventh generation, so Moses is the seventh generation from Abraham, so you have to figure out who Moses is, you have to figure out what Abraham was, because you're counting seven from Abraham. Right, so in other words, the Medrash talks about the seventh generation, Moses to Abraham, and the Rebbe was extrapolating to our seventh generation from the first for Chabad Rebbe. But the point is, so there's a little bit of an analysis of the life of Abraham, and in that discourse, which is really the mission statement, he quotes this verse: "Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem Kelalam." He called in the name of God, God world. Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem. He called there in the name of God, Kelalam, God world, not God of the world, and in very short, in two sentences, he gave the following interpretation. So you're teaching about monotheism. You're teaching about God. God exists. Okay, that's interesting. But that statement leads to many more questions, which is what is the relationship between God and the world? So God exists as an infinite being that is undefined, that cannot be seen and cannot be defined. Okay, very good. Now what? Now, if he's so transcendent and he's beyond time and space, then I have no relationship with him, right? So just introducing monotheism doesn't necessarily is not enough. You have to then talk about what is God and is he interested in morality, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more to say, and that's what probably kept Abraham busy. But what theological truth is alluded to in Kel Olam? So first of all, last parsha it says he called the name of God. God exists. Here, he called the name of God the God of the world. So all of a sudden, it's a verse that emphasizes the relationship between God and the world. God of the world, God world. That's point one. But a deeper, so in other words, not just that God exists and removed from creation, the way many philosophers believed, but God is involved and interested and invested in creation. Okay, that's the first step. That's Kel Olam, God of the world. So that's also a big deal that we didn't hear about last week's parsha, because before you can talk about God's relationship with the world, you have to say there's one God and the idols aren't true and there's only one truth. Okay, fine. Once you explain that, now the next step is this parsha, Kel Olam, God of the world. There's a relationship between God and the world. Okay, very nice. Then you talk about the grammar. Doesn't say God of the world. He says God world. What does that mean? If you say God of the world, it means that there's two entities. There's God and there's world. And God maybe controls the world, maybe he's interested in the world, is the creator of the world, everything is fine. But there's still a dichotomy. There's God and there's the world. And that dichotomy creates holiness, spiritual and physical, and holiness and negativity, right? It's all about the dichotomy because there's two entities, two separate entities. But Judaism, we don't believe in two entities. We believe that God is one. And the Hasidic interpretation, as we discussed on Friday mornings when we did the Tanya, the second section of Tanya, the gate of unity and faith, is that the ultimate truth of the I statement, God is one, means there's nothing other than God. Why? Not because the world doesn't exist, because the world is not outside of God. Ultimately, the world can only exist because God creates it at every moment, because there's the divine energy within every creation, creating everything continuously. So the deeper truth is not that there's a dichotomy between God and the world, and there is good and there's evil, and there is spiritual and physical. That's on the surface level. That's Lech Lecha. That's last parsha. If you go deeper and you get to the true reality of the world, what truth are you getting to? You're getting to the truth that there is nothing outside of God, because the world is not an independent existence. So when I look at the tree, I could see something that is outside, separate from Hashem. It has its own identity, but then has some sort of relationship. God created it either currently or in the past, or God created a different tree and that tree gave birth to this tree. Whatever I want to think about it, but the tree is its own identity. When you get to the true mystical interpretation is, when I see the tree, what do I see? I see the divine power to create. I see an expression of the divine power to create. I don't see the art. I mean, I see the art. When I see the art, I see the artist, right? Because you can look at the world, and by the way, the word olam, and that's part of the world here, he called the name of God Kel Olam, the God of the world. The word olam, the etymology of the Hebrew word for olam is the word helem, concealment. And essentially that's it. So the word for world or cosmos or existence is concealment. Why is that the word? You need a word for world. Why would you say concealment? Because essentially that's what creation is. Creation is the concealment of the presence of God, because creation tells you that we're outside of we're outside of we're outside of the we're outside of we are outside of God. We're our own identity. So the creation says, "I'm my own identity." By the way, the word bara, God created, comes from the Aramaic word bar, which means outside. And the word existence also comes from the word ex, which is exit, which is outside, right? So existence means I'm outside the presence of God. There's God's unity. And then creation is something outside of God. But that is a concealment. That's not the truth. That's olam, that's he'elem, that's concealment. Then you come to this parsha. What's the name of this parsha? Vayera, which means God appeared to Abraham, which means revelation. And you want to step back a second? Where does the revelation take place? After circumcision. What's circumcision? Circumcision is removing the concealment. That's just physically what that's the physical idea of what a circumcision is. So, in other words, you get to the point where the concealment is removed. And then it says, what happens? Vayera elav Hashem, God appeared to Abraham. So we think, the Medrash says, God came to Abraham to visit him because he wasn't feeling well on the third day of the circumcision. But the Hasidic way of saying it, the moment you move the concealment, God appears to you because God was always here all the time, right? So Vayera elav Hashem, God appeared to him because he removed the concealment. In other words, what glasses are you wearing? Till now, in the last parsha, and that's the natural state, creation tells you a story of concealment. Creation tells you not that I'm created by a higher source, but I'm my own existence. I have the rules of nature, the rules of physics. I'm here because I'm here. That's what creation is. I think personally, I think that's one of the differences, the defining factors between the difference between a physical entity and a spiritual entity. The spiritual entity always is going to direct you toward its source. I am an extension of a source. A spiritual an idea. What's the source of the idea? Right? So a spiritual creation, an angel or anything is going to, I feel spiritual. I feel part of something greater than self. I feel that I have a source. An emotion has a source, which is an awareness, etc. So everything has a source. The only thing that has no source, or appears to have no source, is the physical world. You look at the physical world, many people would say it was always here. That's the world in the state of concealment. When you remove the concealment, when you get to a state of revelation, when you remove the concealment, automatically you see the truth. What's the truth? God is always here. God appeared to him because God was always here. When he moved the coverings, he saw God. And then what happens? Now his own experience, he teaches to everybody else. I could look at the world, there's two ways to look at it. I could say there's something outside of God created by God, wonderful, but there's something that's outside of God. Or I could say, when I look around the world, what do I see? I only see an extension of God's creative power. So essentially, God and the world, you cannot divide it into two entities because that's duality. And that has a lot of ramifications because physical and spiritual are no longer in conflict. And the good and evil are also no longer in conflict because even the evil supports or serves a good purpose, right? There's evil here so that our choices to choose the good is meaningful. But ultimately, there's nothing outside the pale of the oneness of God. So that's something that changes in this parsha that doesn't happen in Lech Lecha. And why does it happen? Circumcision, which is removing concealments, and you're getting to the deeper reality, and you're seeing God everywhere, and you're seeing the world. No longer do you see the tree as a tree, but you see the tree as an expression of the divine power to create. And that's what he tells. Not only tells it to himself, but he's preaching this to everybody. And the Medrash describes that the people coming to him were Arabians, not Arabs. They were Arabians, that they were a very low level in theology. They would bow to the dust on their feet. That's what the Medrash says. And here he's teaching them monotheism. There's only one God that can't be seen. And a deeper point is God is the God of the world. And a deeper point is God world. The world is not its own identity. It doesn't have its own identity. It's nothing but the expression, the expression of the divine energy to create. So that's a lot of theology to put it into one letter, actually one missing letter. So you see that what the missing letter teaches is very significant. So when you study Torah, you're not just learning what the words say, what the letters say, but you also have to think about what letters are we missing and what the message of that is. Okay, go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, for this deep idea. So do we consider that after Abraham's circumcision, that perception of reality is available to
Yes.
Jews and also non-Jews,
Yeah.
and especially those who do circumcision, which is Arabs.
Right. So when Abraham almost like blazes the trail, right? And we know that Nachmanides talks about this. We mentioned this that the whole Genesis is really a distraction. If you look at the Torah and you think of Torah as lesson and commandments, so what do I need the stories of the patriarchs? It's interesting, but if you want interesting, buy the Medrash. Why does that be in the Torah? Why is it in the book of law? Why are the stories in the book of law? So there's all kinds of answers. But One answer would be, and Nachmanides' answer is that everything that happens in the stories of the patriarchs, they're paving the way for the children. It's a sign. It's a sign for the children. Ma'aseh Avot, the actions of the patriarchs, of the fathers, are a simon, are a sign to the children. Now, even that statement can mean different things. What does a sign mean? A sign means it's going to happen, or a sign is actually blazing the trail. Because Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt and they come out with more wealth, that allows that when we go to Egypt, we also have the spiritual power to do it, right? So the way we read the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs is that they are starting the journey, but they're not just doing it on their behalf and telling us what to do, but in a way they're doing it for us. They're making the change. They're bringing the change into the world, and then it makes it easier for everyone else to access it.
And by the world, you mean all humanity.
Ultimately, all humanity, especially when you talk about Abraham, because there's another thing to think about is the conflict or the tension between Abraham and Sarah that appears last week's parsha and in this week's parsha. And again, there's development because in last week's parsha, this week's parsha sort of Abraham sort of thought, okay, we don't want to get into that. The bottom line is the tension exists. And what is the root of the tension between Abraham and Sarah? The root of the tension is that Abraham is universal. Abraham, God says, Av Hamon Goyim, you are a father of the multitude of nations. And Sarah is the matriarch of the Jewish people, not of a multitude of nations. Her job is to cultivate the particular specific Jewish identity. Abraham is the father of the Jewish people, but you don't have to be Jewish to be connected to God. So Abraham is saying specifically, God is telling Abraham, there are multiple nations. We don't want everyone to be the same. We don't want everyone to become Jewish. But somebody has to have you have spiritual responsibility for the multitude of nations. So Abraham's story is obviously also has impact for the rest of the world and has ramifications to the rest of the world. And his refinement represents the potential that the rest of the world can get to. And the proof is that he preached this not to people who were the children of the Jewish people. He preached this to the Arabians. And he taught them not just that God exists. Now, they were at a very low level. Sometimes they were the reason why they acknowledged God because they were pressured because it was cheaper than paying the bill. But that doesn't matter. Abraham is still pushing his teaching and sharing his perspective. Now, there's shortcomings to that. When you it's top down. Top down has its shortcomings. But that's Abraham's story. Abraham's chesed, he's giving his preaching. He's less interested in what the students are able to assimilate. He's more interested in giving the truth. And that has certain advantages and certain drawbacks. But that's the story of Abraham. So he's teaching this to everybody. He's not reserving this to the people who are circumcised or who are willing to join his clan. He's teaching this to everybody. This is universal.
Beautiful. So he made it accessible to everyone, and now it's up to each individual person to ask.
Yes. You have to open your eyes. The Rebbe always said, especially at the end of his life, that talking about, he was like, Mashiach is coming at any moment. That was like for 40 years. And then at the end of his life, he's like, Mashiach is already here. You just have to open your eyes. In other words, it's really a matter, redemption is perspective, right? Nothing is going to happen. Mashiach comes, what's going to happen? Is the world going to be different? No, it's going to be the same world. What's changed is our eyes are opened. In other words, our perception of reality changes. And that's where transformation happens. And sometimes that's the drawback. That's sometimes the difference between exile and redemption, or being enslaved or being free, is all perception. And we've seen that in the political world, both in the Soviet Union and in the Arab Spring. Not that I'm endorsing any political movements or I'm endorsing the Arab Spring, but the idea that the freedom doesn't have to take a lot of time. Redemption is a state of mind. But you have to develop that and you have to cultivate it. But ultimately, it's a matter of Vayera, of perception.
Powerful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. If memory serves me correctly, Adam was born with no foreskin. He had no foreskin, and when I think he was banished, the foreskin grew. Now, isn't that an oxymoron in that if revelation has to do with being circumcised, and yet Adam had never taken of the fruit of knowledge? I mean, wasn't he kind of a dumb blonde in the Garden of Eden? And would the revelation have been meaningless because he had no knowledge?
In a way, yes. In a way, the way, at least the way the Kabbalah puts it, the there was always there was the Garden of even in the Garden of Eden, there was always the concept of negativity in the world. The difference is that they were in two distinct places. And that's why they were called the peel. You have the fruit and you have the peel. And the peel and the fruit are distinct. So you could be in the Garden of Eden, where you only have revelation and you don't have any experience, any interaction with the concealment. And they're two separate existences. And the Kabbalah says that the problem with the fruit of the tree the problem with the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that the good and evil mix. It's not that you see the change. It's not that now you know evil. No, the problem is now the good and the evil is mixed together, and that's the real concealment. And now, so in other words, and now you have to separate the two. You have to figure out which part of this is holy, which part of it. Everything is a mix. There's no good without bad. There's no bad without good. Right? Even in the most righteous person, there's some level of ego. And even in the most egotistical person, narcissistic person, there could be sparks of holiness, sparks of good. And you have to really figure out how to separate the two. So that what I'm trying to say is, in the Garden of Eden, yes, there's revelation, but the revelation is in a very specific place, and it's very protected. And then there's other spaces outside of the Garden of Eden, and those are evil. Now, there was no one living there, so there wasn't evil. But you see what happens when we're banished from the Garden of Eden. We're now in negativity, and very quickly the world turns to corruption. So yes, so I agree that that Adam is in a state of revelation, but the state of revelation is the meaning is very limited because it was given to him, it wasn't earned by him, and it was only in a limited space. And with Abraham on his own, he comes out of the darkness, right? The spiritual darkness, and he discovers God on his own, and he's creating the light. And he's removing the circumcision. And he circumcises himself. The Medrash says, the Medrash has this description about the verse because it says that I forget already the verses, but it sounds like that God is doing it with Abraham. So we could talk about circumcision, and in a way, circumcision is top down. But even in the circumcision, if we'll have time, we'll get into it. But Abraham himself is circumcising himself. In other words, this is something that he does on his own. He is the one who brings the light. And Isaiah talks about Abraham as last week's Haftorah as the one who brings the light from the east. Miheir mi mizrach tzedek, and the point is that he's bringing the light. So with Adam, it was he has sort of a sanctuary is created for him. He's placed. He could either be in it or outside of it. Abraham is coming from the darkness and bringing out the light, and therefore his action is actually going to bring the revelation of the potential for other people as well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So that is a little bit about what did we talk about so far? Because there's so much to talk about, but I want to just have at least a common theme. What did we talk about? We talked about the division between the parshas and say how Abraham develops. And what did we say? First thing that develops is that Abraham in the first parsha is as maybe a spiritual person, but it doesn't necessarily affect the physical. And the test of that is, and the place where you see that is, he cannot experience the divine revelation while being in civilization talking to other people. He's either falling off his chair on the floor or he's dreaming. Then you have the circumcision. The circumcision represents the sanctification and the permeation of the light of God, of holiness into the physical flesh. And therefore the physical flesh is changed. And therefore Abraham is a changed person. And therefore God could talk to him and communicate to him while he's sitting at the tent, while he's sitting and interacting with other people. Okay, that was step one. Then we talk about what does that do for Abraham's understanding of the world and also on his day job, which is preaching the oneness of Hashem. And we say there's a radical shift, even though it's alluded to only with two words, Kel Olam, and then dropping of the letter Kel HaOlam. The radical shift. What's the shift? No longer is there a creation and God. No longer is there dichotomy, good and evil, creation, God, physical, spiritual. I remember these things are related, just like the whole idea of circumcision is that the holiness could affect the physical body. Okay, so what's Kel Olam? There's no longer any. I mean, there is division. There is good and evil. Don't get me wrong. But we're saying when you go deeper, when you look beneath the externality and you get to the core, the energy of God, everything in this world is just God creating it, then the evil ultimately is part of the plan. Why is the evil here? So that we could reject it, refine it, change it, channel it, etc. But we know what's at its core. It doesn't have its own independent existence. It is nothing other than the divine energy creating it. So that is why that is one change that happens. That is one change. That's a very important change that happens with Abraham. Okay, now I want to say one more change, which is a broad topic. We really should spend an hour on that. Well, the next two topics are really an hour each, but we're going to try to do it all together because today I wasn't sure what to talk about today. Today it turns out that the theme is that we're putting the whole Vayera into one theme. So we're going to do that. Another point that Chabad Hasidism talks about a lot is related to the idea that we mentioned earlier that the physical could actually be made holy. In other words, how do you break the division between physical and spiritual? And there's all kinds of angles of how to get into this topic, but one way to think about it is from the following approach. The Medrash tells us that Abraham kept the whole Torah even before it was given. In other words, Torah wasn't formally given, but Abraham understood either he had prophecy or he intuited of what the Torah is going to be, and therefore he kept the whole Torah. And it's actually in this week's parsha where he tells his wife when the guests come, and he tells his wife to bake lushi vasiugot, knead the bread and make round cakes. The Medrash says it was actually Passover, and he was making matzah for Passover. And because we know Isaac was born, as the Medrash says, Isaac was born on Passover, and Isaac was born exactly a year later because the angel says I'm coming back in exactly 1 year, and you're going to have a son. So the point is that Abraham keeps the whole Torah. So now the question is, if Abraham keeps the whole Torah, why doesn't he circumcise himself? Before God tells him to do that. And that's a question. It may seem like it's a technical question, but it's a question that many sources ask, and the many answers given. But the Hasidic interpretation, specifically the Chabad, and specifically the Rebbe's teaching, spends a lot of time on this question because of what the insight that this question leads us to. So why can't Abraham circumcise himself? So the Hasidic answer is as follows. There is a division in the world between physical and spiritual. Nobody could bridge that divide. Abraham himself cannot bridge that divide. The only person that can bridge that divide, the only entity that can bridge that divide is God himself. God, who's the creator of the physical and the spiritual, could now empower us to bridge the two. Only God could make the physical holy. We cannot. And that's why the Medrash tells us, well, it's not the Medrash, it's Zohar. Zohar tells us that the patriarchs, everything they did in this world had a mystical effect, but it did not really have a physical effect. In other words, when we do a mitzvah, the belief is that it has a physical effect on the world. So for example, if you're going to take an animal and you're going to take its parchment, take its skin and write parchment and write Hashem's name on it and write a mezuzah, the mezuzah is holy. You can't discard the mezuzah. You have to bury it. So we believe that our effect of our mitzvot actually changes the physical reality of the world. How so? Not because we're so great and we could change the physical reality, but because it's God's commandments. So God says, if you do this, you will make this physical object holy. The patriarchs who operated before the Torah was given, so they also did certain things to commemorate, to tap into that energy of what our Torah does and teaches. But that effect did not affect the physical world and remained in the spiritual worlds. And the Zohar says, if you read in a few portions, we'll read about Jacob and Jacob's shepherding the sheep of his father-in-law, and then there's this whole long description of how he took different sticks and he made different shapes to affect how the offsprings of the sheep And the Zohar says, don't think that that Isaac is just has different sticks, but those sticks, what we achieve through our tefillin, says the Zohar, Abraham achieves through the work with his sticks. Okay, that's nice to know. But there's a big difference between the tefillin and the sticks. What's the difference? The difference is when you finish with the tefillin, you can't throw it in the garbage. When you finish with the sticks, you can throw it in the garbage because the sticks are just a symbol for something that's happening in the spiritual world. But the sticks cannot become holy because you cannot, nobody, not Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, nobody could take a physical object and make it holy. There's a gap between physical and spiritual. The only person who can bridge the gap is God himself. When he gives us the commandments. When he gives us the commandment, he says, do this and the holiness will enter. Okay. What is circumcision? Circumcision is a symbol, not just for any mitzvah, but that the holiness permeates the physical flesh. Who could make the holiness permeate the physical flesh? Not Abraham. It would be counterproductive to do a symbol for something that's impossible to do. So Abraham has to wait until God commands him to do so that the symbol will be effective. Because the symbol is not that you're doing something in the spiritual world, you're doing something in the physical world. So in other words, so one of the big changes is that now finally Abraham is able to do the circumcision, which is number one, which is the ability to affect change in the physical world. But this origin of that is Abraham can go beyond the potential of the human being. The human being can only go so high, but you're going to reach a limit of how high you can go. The commandment allows you to break through that barrier. So in other words, it affects the ramification is in the physical world. Could you affect the material world? But if you could, it's not because you only have the skill of going low, it's because you tapped into the essence, and the essence is not defined by physical or spiritual. And that's the Kabbalistic concept that to go low, you have to go high. Only the highest thing can come down the lowest. So if you can affect the lowest place, it's because you tapped into the highest place. And now, so hopefully these are the ingredients. This is how the parsha, the bottom line is that if you need the title for this class or the subtitle, it's that this parsha is a completely new Abraham. Where do you see it? Number one, he is changed. He can experience the divine presence when he's in the physical world talking to people. Number two, you could see it in what he is teaching. Not God exists, but God of the world, and more specifically, God world. There's no really division between God and the world because the world itself, you remove the concealment and the world itself is nothing but an expression of the divine power to create and the ability to change the physical flesh. And that comes only by the commandments. So Abraham post-commandment, he only had one commandment. He didn't have a lot of commandments. I mean, he had other commandments, but none of the mitzvot that we do after the giving of the Torah, the only one he was commanded to do is the circumcision. He was commanded to do other things, to migrate to Israel, but that's not so much related to our Torah. Of our Torah, the mitzvot that we do, the only thing he was commanded to is circumcision, because that represents the point of Abraham starting the process of what? Of sanctifying the physical, and that can only come by commandment, because that's when you tap into the infinite power of God. And when you get to the infinite power of God, then the division between physical and spiritual breaks down because there are no barriers to God. But a human being can never achieve that on his own, because a human being is always the gravity. There's always how high you can go. You can't go higher. You're going to reach the potential, and that's it. Okay, that's a little bit of a summary. I hope this was enjoyable and interesting and thought-provoking. Go ahead, Karina, please.
Okay, a quick question. What about women regarding like this mark in the flesh?
Yeah.
Is it related that women give birth? And that's like very
Okay. That could be. In other words, with women, you have other places where you see the infinity of God. In fact, the Kabbalah teaches that the only place where you see everything in this world is finite and limited. The only place where you see true infinity, at least in the person, is the power to procreate. Why? Because if you procreate, at least in potential, theoretically, you can have infinite generations. Well, you need a planet, you need the sun not to burn out, but that's a technicality. In other words, the idea that the potential of one child to keep giving birth to other children, subsequent generations, is the expression of the koach ha'in sof, of the power of infinity that is in the world, and that is evident in giving birth. So that could be the answer. I know the Gemara says a woman is like she's circumcised already. In other words, it's not that a woman doesn't have circumcision. With the woman, it already happened. In other words, the concealment was never there to begin with. And that's also spiritually. Spiritually, the woman is more spiritual, and therefore the concealment is not as sharp to begin with. So the idea that you have to remove the concealment is less evident because the concealment is less pronounced. And that's why naturally women are more spiritual. Now, maybe it's not politically correct to say this. Maybe I should have turned off the recording. Maybe I'm going to get hate mail, but I'm probably going to still stand behind my statement. I mean, of course, there's differences. You can't generalize. There are people who are spiritual, and there are men who are more spiritually sensitive, and women who are not. But if you have to generalize, and it's not good to generalize, but occasionally their generalizations are helpful. So that's what I would say. I would generalize in that way.
Thanks.
But the truth is that the milah, the circumcision, is only a symbol. We believe it happens in every single mitzvah. Every single mitzvah you do brings holiness into the object of the world and into the physical organ that does that mitzvah. So when you light candles, your hand is becoming holy. When you give charity, your hand is becoming refined. Now you don't see it. Okay, when Mashiach comes, we'll see it.
And if we go back to the idea that you presented at the beginning, the potential to tap into this perception is available to both.
Yes. Yeah. And to make any person who does something good in the world, you feed the poor, your piece of bread, that physical entity, that physical object is becoming holy. That's not related necessarily, that's not restricted just to Jewish people.
Or to gender.
Right. And then that's really what the Tanya talks about in chapter 37, which is when does Mashiach come? When all the Jewish people do the mitzvot, and essentially every part of the world is elevated. Now you're going to say every part of the world, we're a limited people. I mean, there are Jews everywhere, but we're not touching every single part of the world. But the answer is maybe we are, especially today, because today, you pick up your iPhone or your Android, and there's pieces in this thing from every part of the world, right? So the chain of production. So when you're doing one thing, when you're eating a piece of bread, and then you think about how many people were involved in this production and who created the tractors to be able to harvest the grain, and who created the technology to be able to create the tractor. And if you start thinking about where the world is so interconnected today and so complex, that when you do one mitzvah and you make you make a blessing on the challah, if you really want to think about it, about every single step in the process to be able to get you to this physical space, you have a very large impact on the world, because the end of the chain elevates the whole what do they call it? Supply chain. The whole supply chain is elevated, not just the supply chain of the raw materials, but also the people involved in the supply chain.
And in your Instagram metaphor, you send the message, and the whole world is accessible to the whole world.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the people, but also who created the Instagram, and who came up with the technology, and who came up with the mathematics to be able to everything. All this got us to this point. So we have that whole chain of command, that whole supply chain, and the end of the supply chain does the mitzvah that elevates the entire supply chain.
Beautiful.
Okay, thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos. We should see Vayera Hashem, God should appear to us, meaning we should see the presence of God wherever we look, and ultimately see only good and the only positivity. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat.
Shabbat Shalom.
Take care. Thank you.